The defining purchase of the American middle class isn't a car, it isn't a college degree, it's a house. The most emotional, most expensive decision most families will ever make. And right now, that decision is about to be blindsided by something almost no one saw coming. Not a housing crash, not a banking failure, not even interest rates. It's wood, Canadian wood, the skeleton of the American dream. The walls, the floors, the roofs, the very frame of a new home. Nearly one-third of it comes from Canada. For 50 years, the United States quietly leaned on that supply. Politicians kept their fights behind closed doors because everyone understood one dangerous truth. The minute lumber becomes political, ordinary Americans pay the price. That rule has just been shattered. Donald Trump stepped into the Rose Garden and announced a 35% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. A bold move, a nationalist move, a move built to project strength. But within hours, Canada fired back, and the response wasn't loud, wasn't emotional, wasn't dramatic. It was colder than that. Canada simply said they would not eat the tariffs, they would not renegotiate, and they would not play the old game. Instead, they would reroute their lumber. Not someday, not maybe, immediately. And here's where this story pivots from politics into something far more dangerous. Canadian producers had already inked framework agreements with buyers in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. Not proposals, not talk, signed commitments, volumes locked in, delivery schedules set, ships ready. The moment American tariffs kick in, Canadian lumber starts moving east and west instead of south. The United States doesn't just lose leverage, it loses supply. Right now, there are only 22 days before the first shipment changes direction. 22 days before the price of every new American home begins to shift. 22 days before builders realize the material they counted on is suddenly heading elsewhere. And once that shift starts, reversing it becomes exponentially harder because lumber markets don't wait for political speeches. They move on contracts, cargo ships, and supply chains that take years to rebuild. For decades, Washington believed Canada had nowhere else to send its wood at scale. Geography protected the United States. Logistics favored the United States. Demand lived in the United States. That assumption kept every previous dispute manageable. But this time, that assumption is dead. The buyers are in place, the contracts are signed, the ships are being chartered, and suddenly the fight Washington thought it controlled has flipped. The leverage is no longer American, it's Canadian. And that changes everything because when supply shifts in housing, the consequences don't show up in headlines first. They show up in mortgage payments. They show up in construction delays. They show up when a young family realizes the house they were about to buy just moved out of reach. This isn't just a tariff fight. This is the beginning of a supply shock aimed straight at the most fragile part of the American economy. And the clock is already ticking. Here's the reality that makes this situation explosive. And it's something most Americans never hear about. The United States doesn't buy Canadian lumber because it wants to. It buys Canadian lumber because it has to. Roughly 32% of all softwood lumber used in American homes comes from Canada. Not a specialty product, not a luxury material, the basic structural wood that holds up walls, floors, and roofs. Take that away, even partially, and the entire construction pipeline starts tightening immediately. And replacing that supply isn't as simple as flipping a switch on American mills. That capacity doesn't exist. It hasn't existed since the 1980s, when the Pacific Northwest timber industry shrank under environmental restrictions, legal battles over old-growth forests, and aging mill infrastructure. For decades, Canada filled the gap quietly. Builders adapted, supply chains stabilized, the housing market learned to depend on it. Now that dependency is about to be tested in real time. To replace Canadian imports, the United States would need between $8 and $12 billion in new mill construction, not blueprints, actual facilities, each one facing permitting timelines that average 5 to 7 years under federal environmental review. Even if construction started tomorrow, the supply wouldn't arrive until well into the next decade. And that assumes something else. The industry is already short on workers. The American forest products labor pool has been shrinking for 30 years. Rebuilding it would take a generation, not a fiscal quarter. The numbers behind this are what's quietly alarming the construction industry right now. The National Association of Home Builders ran the model. If Canadian lumber imports drop by just 50%, the average cost of building a new single-family home rises between $22,000 and $37,000 within 6 months. Not years, months. That's not speculation. That's how commodity markets behave when supply contracts suddenly. We've seen this movie before, and the ending wasn't pretty. In 2021, a much smaller supply disruption pushed lumber prices up by 370% in 9 months. The average cost of a new home jumped by roughly $36,000. And that happened without tariffs, without trade retaliation, without any government deliberately redirecting exports. It happened by accident. What's coming now is deliberate, larger, and far harder to reverse. Drop that kind of price increase into today's housing market, and the damage hits instantly. The median new home already sits around $420,000. Mortgage rates hover just above 7%. Affordability is already near the worst level since records began in 1971. Add another $30,000, and the pressure doesn't spread evenly. It concentrates on first-time buyers, especially those between 27 and 34 years old. A generation already trailing historic homeownership rates is about to get pushed even further out of the market. This is why builders aren't reacting publicly yet. But internally, the concern is real, because once costs move, they can't absorb them forever. They pass them on, buyers step back, projects get delayed, and what looks like a trade dispute suddenly becomes a housing slowdown. Not dramatic at first, just fewer starts, fewer permits, fewer cranes on the skyline. But that's how a supply shock begins. Quietly, then all at once. And the first signs of that shift are already forming behind the scenes. Now, this is where the situation stops looking like a normal trade dispute and starts looking like a chain reaction. Because what's coming isn't one shock, it's a sequence, a domino effect that unfolds over roughly 120 days, each step tightening pressure on a different part of the American economy. And once the first domino falls, the rest become extremely difficult to stop. The first domino hits the moment the tariffs take effect. Traders in the commodity markets move before the physical shortage even appears. Futures spike as soon as supply is expected to shrink. Analysts are already projecting a 12 to 15% jump in North American lumber prices almost immediately. Wholesalers who saw this coming begin unwinding hedges, locking in profits, and accelerating the price movement. Nothing has actually disappeared yet, but the market behaves as if it has. That's how expectations become reality. The second domino falls about 3 weeks later. American lumber inventories typically cover about 45 days of demand across distribution networks. When Canadian shipments start redirecting to Europe and Asia, those inventories begin draining faster than they can be replaced. Distributors start rationing supply. And here's the critical detail. Small builders get cut off first. Large national builders have long-term contracts with priority clauses. They still get material. Smaller regional builders don't. Projects stall, construction timelines stretch, financing costs rise, and suddenly the slowdown is visible on the ground. The third domino arrives around day 90. Builders who've been swallowing higher costs as long as possible finally start passing them to buyers. New home prices move higher, sometimes quietly through upgrades, sometimes directly through base price increases. At the same time, existing homes stop getting cheaper because when new construction becomes more expensive, older homes look like a bargain. That stabilizes prices across the broader housing market. What was supposed to be cooling suddenly stops cooling. Affordability tightens even further. And then comes the fourth domino, the one with the biggest consequences. Around day 120, the Federal Reserve faces a dilemma with no easy answer. Cut interest rates to support a slowing housing market and risk fueling inflation as construction costs rise. Hold rates to fight inflation and watch housing weaken further, dragging jobs and consumer spending down with it. Either choice damages a different pillar of the broader economic strategy. Either choice signals that a tariff on lumber has spilled into macroeconomic policy. This is why the timeline matters. 22 days to the first domino. Then weeks, not years, before the next ones follow. And the housing market absorbing the shock is already fragile. The United States builds roughly 1.4 million housing units per year. Demand is higher than that. Supply is tight. Prices are elevated. Mortgage rates are restrictive. It's not a market with room for error. It's a market balanced on a narrow edge. When a shock like this hits, it doesn't collapse everything at once. It breaks the weakest link. And right now, that weakest link is first-time buyers. The people trying to enter the market for the first time. The ones with limited savings, tight debt ratios, and mortgages that barely qualify. Add another $20,000 or $30,000, and many of them simply disappear from the buyer pool. Not gradually, immediately. Contracts fall through, applications drop. Builders lose their most important customer segment. And that's how a tariff that started as a political signal turns into a housing slowdown, which then risks becoming an economic one. Not because of panic, not because of speculation, but because a third of the material used to build homes suddenly begins moving somewhere else. And by the time the public notices, the first three dominoes may already be down. What makes this confrontation even more dangerous is that Canada didn't improvise this response. This wasn't a knee-jerk reaction to a tariff announcement. This was a contingency plan years in the making. The majority of Canadian softwood lumber production sits in British Columbia, and the ports positioned to ship that lumber across the Pacific, Prince Rupert and Vancouver, have been quietly expanding capacity since 2019. More container space, more bulk handling, more rail connectivity from inland mills straight to export terminals. The infrastructure to bypass the United States already exists. That detail changes the entire balance of power. Because for decades, the assumption in Washington was simple. Canada needed the American market more than America needed Canadian lumber. Geography favored that conclusion. Shipping south by rail was cheaper than crossing oceans. American demand was predictable. Alternatives were limited. But over the last 8 years, Canadian producers started hedging against that dependence. They built relationships in Europe. They explored demand in Japan. They negotiated with South Korea. They tested logistics to the United Kingdom, quietly, methodically, without headlines. So when the tariff appeared, Canada didn't scramble. It activated. Framework agreements were already drafted. Buyers were already identified. Logistics already modeled. Ships already available. This week's announcement wasn't a threat. It was the switch being flipped. That means something important. The window to reverse course without long-term damage may already be closing. Once mills adapt to different specifications for European and Asian markets, switching back isn't instant. Lumber grading standards differ. Construction codes differ. Contract structures differ. Over time, those differences create friction that locks in new trade flows. And that's the scenario few policymakers seem to be taking seriously. If Canadian lumber begins flowing east and west consistently, those relationships harden. Contracts get renewal clauses. Buyers build planning assumptions around Canadian supply. Shipping lanes become routine. Investment follows demand. Mills upgrade equipment for new markets. What began as a temporary redirection quietly becomes a permanent realignment. By the time tariffs eventually fade, the old supply chain no longer exists in the same form. This is how a short-term political move turns into a long-term structural shift. The American housing market spends decades relying on Canadian wood. Then one confrontation encourages Canada to diversify. Once diversified, dependence disappears. And when dependence disappears, leverage disappears with it. The United States may still impose tariffs, but the impact weakens because the supplier no longer needs the buyer. There's another layer to this. Canada isn't just responding to the United States. Other American allies are watching closely. Europe, Japan, South Korea, all economies that trade critical materials with the United States. They're watching to see whether Washington assumes every import can be replaced and every partner can be pressured. If Canada successfully redirects something as large as lumber, it sends a message. Diversification works. Alternatives exist. Dependence can be reduced. That lesson spreads beyond wood. And that's why this fight is larger than it appears. It's not just about housing materials. It's about whether the North American supply chain that existed for decades begins to fragment. Once fragmentation begins, rebuilding it is slow, expensive, and politically complicated. The tariffs may last months, but the structural consequences can last years. And by the time the shift becomes obvious, the cargo ships will already be sailing in different directions. So now we arrive at the real question: what happens next? Because from this point forward, there are only 3 paths, and none of them are clean. The first possibility is the quiet retreat. The tariff gets softened, delayed, or quietly walked back before the 30-day window closes. The explanation would likely be vague. Progress in broader negotiations. Constructive dialogue, something diplomatic. Canadian lumber keeps flowing. Markets calm down. The dominoes stop before they fall. But this scenario comes with a political cost. Walking back a tariff after announcing it publicly signals miscalculation. It invites other trading partners to test Washington again. And historically, that's not a move this administration makes easily. The second scenario is follow-through. The tariffs take effect. Canada redirects exports exactly as promised. American builders scramble for supply that doesn't exist. Prices rise. Housing starts slow. Construction jobs begin to soften. The Federal Reserve faces pressure to cut rates to stabilize housing, even as inflation risks climb. In this version, the United States technically wins the confrontation by not backing down. But the victory is narrow. The broader economic cost spreads across housing, employment, and affordability. The tariff holds, but the market absorbs the damage. The third scenario is the one that carries the longest shadow. Canada redirects lumber, not temporarily, but permanently. Contracts with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom get extended. Mills adapt to new standards. Shipping routes normalize. American buyers become just one option among many. By the time negotiations eventually resolve the tariff, the old flow south never fully returns. The United States spends the next decade trying to replace a supply chain it once had by default. and the economics of home building change for a generation. That's why this moment matters. Because this isn't just a trade policy experiment. It's a test of a broader theory. The idea that every import can be replaced and every partner can be compelled. In some sectors, that theory holds. In others, it doesn't. Lumber appears to be one of the places where it doesn't. The replacement capacity isn't ready. The timeline is too long. And tariffs, instead of forcing compliance, risk accelerating diversification. The people who feel this first aren't negotiators. They're families. The couple trying to buy their first home. The retiree downsizing to something affordable. The builder who planned projects months in advance. The construction worker watching permits slow. None of them made the tariff decision. All of them will absorb the consequences. Because